Welcome back to Apologetics. Today I'm going to be discussing how it's logical to believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We're going to be using abductive reasoning, which is a logical process that involves observations to determine the most likely explanation for a set of facts. So I'll give you those facts and we'll go through 7 different hypotheses to explain those facts. So thank you for joining. I understand two of the biggest challenges that people have when it comes to believing in the resurrection is overcoming. So I need you to open up your heart, your mind to the potential for supernatural. And the second is that people haven't researched it enough to actually know all the facts of the resurrection story.
All right, so this is the criteria we're going to use to test whether or not the hypothesis holds any weight. So these are pretty minimalist facts that are accepted by atheist scholars. There could be more that could be acceptable, but we're not going to even use that. We're going to use a minimalist approach, and that's at the detriment of Christianity. But Jesus died by crucifixion and was buried in a tomb. That tomb was then empty 3 days later. The disciples claimed to see the resurrected Jesus, and that the disciples were transformed after seeing the resurrected Jesus. So the first hypothesis is Jesus didn't die. Well, the first fact we have to check and see if that meshes with is Jesus died by crucifixion and was buried in a tomb. So we're going to probably move through this one pretty quickly. But I want to share an interesting fact regarding Jesus' crucifixion. When he in fact had died, in order to ensure he died, a Roman soldier pierced through Jesus' ribs into his heart and blood and water came out, which is called pericardial effusion. But the thing is that's really cool about that being a part of the gospel story is that that was not an understood medical term or condition at that time. So really it was like earliest documentation of that particular condition that was not really well understood until even the 18th century. So it gives a little bit of credence to the gospel testimony in and of itself. This is one of my favorite hypotheses that the disciples made the story up. Basically, and these were cowardly men. They ran away when Jesus was captured, with the exception of Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times. But these cowardly men snuck past Roman guards, rolled open the tomb, took the body, disposed of the body, and made up the story of the resurrection. Now, this does do a good job of explaining that Jesus did die by crucifixion. He was buried in the tomb, so we got that one. It does explain how the tomb was empty, and it does explain that the disciples claimed to see the resurrected Jesus because they made that story up. What it doesn't do is it doesn't explain how the disciples were transformed after seeing the resurrected Jesus. That's a very important component because they were facing death. Many of them were crucified themselves. They would face torture. Many were jailed for long periods of time. It was not a good life. There was no motive for making this story up. They would not get power. They would not get sex. They would not get money. Those are the primary motivators for human beings, and they got none of those things. In fact, they got suffering and death. The Babylon Bee does an outstanding job of putting this in a satirical sense. So I'm going to attach that at the end of this video if you want to check it out. It is, regardless of your beliefs, it is objectively just a funny video. All right, so the third hypothesis is that there were 500 plus witnesses of the resurrected Jesus at different times, different places, and with sometimes large groups of people that had a shared hallucination. You are freaking out, man. Now, that does do a great job of explaining why the disciples claimed to see the resurrected Jesus and why the disciples were transformed, but it doesn't do a very good job of explaining why the tomb was empty. Because if they were just hallucinating, the body would have still been in the tomb. And again, if they just wanted to get rid of all this Christian malarkey, all you got to do is produce the body. Boom, Christianity's no more. It doesn't hold any weight if you can produce the body. All right, so the fourth hypothesis is that the disciples were fooled by an imposter. So somebody dressed up like Jesus, acted like Jesus, and was able to fool the disciples. Now, some key things you need to look at for this one. First, to get off, again, we have a tomb that was empty. So it doesn't explain the body. Other things we really need to take into account with this hypothesis is that who would have the motive to trick the disciples into trying to believe that Jesus was resurrected? Who would have anything to gain from that? I can't come up with an answer for that particular one. And then third, how could anybody trick the disciples? Jesus was someone they had just spent the last 3 years with on a daily basis, not just seeing him daily, all day, every day. So you're going to have to be convincing with your voice, convincing with your mannerisms, convincing with everything. Not to mention he just died. So how believable is it that they had already given up? So it's not very feasible to me that this would be a likely scenario, and you still don't have an answer for why the tomb is empty. In the fifth hypothesis, it is claimed that maybe one or two of the disciples had really strong spiritual visions or dreams that they believed to be real of the resurrected Christ, and that they shared those visions or those experiences as real, legitimate sightings of a risen Christ. And then the other disciples took those real stories and passed them along as their own as well. What this doesn't do is it doesn't take into account all the different situations where Christ was actually seen. The resurrected Christ was seen, as noted in 1 Corinthians 15, by over 500 people. Additionally, that doesn't explain why the disciples wouldn't, recant that story when pressed by torture or even being crucified themselves. It doesn't really hold much water in those scenarios because it doesn't account for all the different stories. And if you're passing along a secondhand story as your own, you're going to recant that if you're facing death. Additionally, it doesn't explain why the tomb is empty and they do not have a body. Hypothesis 6 is probably the one that resonates with most non-Christians the most. I know it did with me. It's a belief that the stories were distorted later. Essentially, they're more myth or legend, something akin to Bigfoot or Nessie. That the resurrection event wasn't really what happened. It just grew more over the hundreds of years that occurred before it was recorded. And actually, the Gospels were written down much earlier than that. I think if you actually look at the stories and what was included in those stories, you can tell when the Gospels were actually written. But regardless of that, the resurrection accounts, you can see the earliest creeds actually date to just a few years after the crucifixion event itself. And at the very end of the day, you still have these checkboxes that anyone from a scholarly historical lens has to give. Jesus died by crucifixion and was buried in a tomb. That tomb was empty 3 days later. The disciples who had ran and hid out of fear for their own lives claimed to see the resurrected Jesus, and then after seeing the resurrected Jesus, believed so fervently that it was true, that he really had risen for them, that they now no longer feared persecution and were willing to die for those beliefs. That's incredibly important in the core of the Christian beliefs, and it has been since right after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. It is not mere myth or legend. And that brings us to the final hypothesis, which is the resurrection is true. Obviously, that will check off each of the boxes. I understand the biggest challenges people will face with this is we use a natural explanation for almost everything in this world. In this particular situation, we're talking about a supernatural event, so you have to be open to a supernatural explanation if you are to accept it. I understand for some people, your hearts may be closed off to that, and that's going to be a hard thing to deal with. But when you look at the facts that are accepted by people, both atheists and theists, the resurrection story actually it checks off each of the boxes to explain the facts that we actually do believe. So my prayer for you is that you're able to open your heart, look at this objectively, and come to a determination yourself. Do more research. I can't express that enough because this isn't something I'm going to be able to tell you and you're just going to believe. But the key is opening up your heart to actually realize that it's possible. It's something, even after becoming a Christian, I hadn't quite considered until I actually did a lot of research on it myself. I'll do future videos to discuss the reliability of, the gospel accounts. There's a strong reason to believe in their reliability, but I created this video because I love each and every one of you that is watching this. Whether you believe this or you don't believe this, just know I care about you. I want you to look at this and come to your own determination. God bless.